Now, I want to put today's story in its context a little bit, and so I'm going to remind you of a couple of things. If you were with us when we looked at them, this is going to make more sense to you. If you weren't, this is going to be sort of a lightning review, so pardon me for that. But we, at the beginning of chapter 15 here in Matthew, looked at the incident that Jesus had, a little debate with the Pharisees about their concern over the traditions of the elders. They came to Jesus and complained that his disciples were not washing their hands in the way that was prescribed in the traditions of the elders before they ate. And Jesus' conclusion from that was, look, it's not what you put in your mouth that makes you dirty. It's what comes out of your mouth that makes you dirty. And the disciples all said, ooh, brilliant. That's a wonderful insight. But to help them get a firm grasp on the concept, Jesus then takes them on a field trip. He takes them on a field trip to meet someone that they would think was a sinner, well, at least partly because of her diet, right? Because maybe she ate foods that, or meats, kinds of animals that were unclean. And they would think, well, this Gentile person, she's unclean. Look what she eats. But their experience with her is fascinating because when you compare what comes out of her mouth with what comes out of the disciples' mouths, it becomes very plain that she is the good Israelite and that they are the pagans who have no real fear of God. How well did the disciples do with this quiz? This little, field trip where they get tested on how well they grasp the concept.
No,
you can talk to me.
No, they didn't do well.
They didn't do well. They flunked the quiz, right? They did not pass the test. They failed to translate the principle that what comes out of your mouth matters more than what goes into your mouth when it was translated into real life. But Jesus grades the quiz with them, right? Did you ever have teachers that did that? You get a quiz and then everybody pass your paper to the next person and then you all grade the quiz together so you got immediate feedback about what you knew and didn't know, right? So Jesus grades the quiz with them and he says, woman, great is your faith. It will be done for you as you desire. In contrast with the disciples, whom he has just told, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt, right? When they're there on the sea and fearful about the wind and the waves. So he lets them know. She gets an A, you get an F. And then he takes them back to the Sea of Galilee area. And though Matthew doesn't make it extremely clear for us here, if we compare with Mark, it seems plain that Jesus has gone to a region around the Sea of Galilee that is also a Gentile region, right? The people here in this feeding of a large crowd are probably not Jews. They're probably from the Gentile nations that lived on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. So it's quite possible that what Jesus is doing is giving the disciples a second chance at their quiz, a second opportunity to translate into real life the principles that he has been sharing with them. So let's listen in on what goes on in this story. And particularly, I want you to pay attention to what comes out of the various mouths in this story. So, departing from there, this is verse 29 again that we just heard. I'll just read a small chunk of it again. Departing from there, Jesus went along by the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up on the mountain, he was sitting there. And large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others, and they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd marveled as they saw the mute speaking, the crippled restored, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Miracles on every side. And what's coming out of the people's mouths? You can talk to me. Yes, they're glorifying the God of Israel. Even though they are probably not Israelites, they are praising the God of Israel. This is in contrast to the Pharisees who showed up where Jesus was healing and doing wonderful miracles, and all they can do is nitpick with him about his disciples not washing their hands, right? But when Jesus goes to the Gentiles, they don't nitpick about what he's doing. they give glory to the God of Israel in light of the wonderful things that he's doing. This is also in contrast to the disciples' silence in the face of the woman's desperate pleas for help, right? The story, and we didn't highlight the whole story, but if you recall, Jesus goes and meets up with this woman, this Canaanite woman, and she's crying out, "Please, Lord, heal my daughter, for she's severely oppressed by a demon." And the disciples are standing there waiting for her to go away and stop bothering Jesus' master. They don't say anything. But here, instead of silence or instead of nitpicking, the people are praising God. Well, what's happening in the background while all this healing and praise is going on? Verse 32, and Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, for they may faint on the way." Now, this is classically compressed biblical narrative. But you follow what's happened here. Jesus is with the people, he's doing miracles, and 3 days go by, and there's no caterer. There's no food. Why are these people staying for 3 days with no food? They haven't been tied up in a knot, right? They're not imprisoned. They are free to go at any time. But they would not miss what is happening here for anything. And 3 days have gone by and they have no food. And what has come out of the disciples' mouths during those 3 days? Well, it's an argument from silence, but I would argue that that's what's come out of their mouths. Nothing. They have not recognized the need of these people for some nourishment in 3 days. Now, you recall when they were on the other side of the lake, and Jesus had Jewish people with him for part of a day. By evening, the disciples were coming around to Jesus going, "Look, everybody's getting really hungry. You got to do something about this. Send them home, Why is it that they were so quick to speak up on behalf of their fellow Jews, and now 3 days have gone by and they have nothing to say about the situation here? Now, I would like to think that the disciples have gained some humility, right? That the last time they spoke up, they ended up regretting it. Right? When Jesus went and met with that Canaanite woman, and he just waited and waited in silence until the disciples started speaking, they said, "Lord, send her away, for she keeps calling out after us." They ended up regretting having spilled the beans of what was in their heads. Because it turns out they were on the wrong side of that argument. What they should have been saying is, "Jesus, don't you hear this woman? Why aren't you helping her?" But instead, what came out their mouths was, "She's bothering us. Why don't you send her away?" So maybe the disciples have learned their lesson. We don't want to speak too soon, right? Maybe Jesus is up to something. We should keep our mouths shut. But is that the right response? No, it certainly is not. They should be saying what Jesus is saying, right? "Jesus, don't you have compassion for these people? I mean, you have wowed them with these miracles, and they can't leave. So please, provide for them. Look, here, we have 7 loaves of bread and a few small fishes. With God's blessing, that should be plenty." Right? Those are the things that should be coming out their mouths. But utter silence until Jesus finally has to speak up himself. Just a principle for you. Saying nothing when the thoughts in your head are evil is better than saying something. But it doesn't make you holy. Are you following me? The disciples probably were better not to say what was in their heads. But the fact that the wrong things were still in their heads is not good for them. How long would the disciples have remained silent if Jesus hadn't spoken up? I wonder. So, again, the silence of Jesus is a test. And how well did the disciples do on their quiz? Not good. They fail. And when Jesus finally speaks, he says, look, I don't want to send them away hungry. They might run out of gas before they get to the service station. Why does Jesus tell his disciples that? We'll put it this way. What do the disciples think Jesus wants from them when he says, I don't want to send the people away hungry. They might run out of gas. Listen, the disciples said to him, verse 33, where would we get so many loaves in this desolate place to satisfy such a large crowd? Don't look at us. Right? Isn't that how they dealt with it the last time? When Jesus said, oh no, they don't need to go away. You feed them. Like, not us. We can't do that. Same response. Only Jesus hasn't even told them, you feed them this time. They're defending themselves. Don't look at us. Before he even says that. All he does is say, look, I don't want to send them away empty. Don't look at us. Do I have caterer written across my shirt? They think Jesus wants them to cater the party, even though he never said so. Now, you have got to be noticing what I noticed with this. What is odd about that answer? In this context, what is strange about the fact that they are saying, don't look at us? In this context. Anybody? They not only know Jesus can do anything, but in this specific context, what did Jesus just do? He just fed 5,000 people 4 or 5 paragraphs over. Right? He did also do all the miracles of healing and everything else, but this exact situation with a different audience just happened. And when they said, don't look at us, they looked foolish. So why in the world would they say the exact same thing in the exact same situation when just a few days ago that turned out to be the wrong answer? Well, they're obviously having trouble with all their quizzes, right? Well, they still have little faith, certainly, compared to some of the unlikely people around them.
Well, the people were all hungry after 3 days. Disciples had 7 loaves and some fish.
Well, they had leftovers, so they must have had some food for 3 days, and maybe they weren't hurting like the people that were there, right? And you can imagine this scene, right? Every day, the disciples go back to the boat, and they pull out the leftovers that they brought from the feeding of the 5,000, and they're sitting there eating while everybody is sacked out on the hill someplace with nothing to eat. Can you imagine? Well, I mean, we don't know. It's quite possible that Jesus didn't eat. Maybe Jesus joined the disciples and ate, waiting to see how long the disciples were going to ignore the situation and eat their lunch, but the disciples still have some food. So it's obvious that they didn't run out 3 days ago. I mean, that's an excellent insight, Dave. I hadn't put those two things together before you said that. I'd heard someone suggest the disciples had their lunches, but there's the evidence that they actually had food. A small amount. They did. They did. But they didn't have enough food to share with everyone unless there's a miracle. But they don't seem to expect a miracle. Why are they not expecting a miracle? Well, but if they followed that, she said, Jesus just said, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But where were they during the rest of that story? Yeah, they didn't, even when the quiz was graded, yeah, they didn't understand the point that he was actually making. They drew the wrong conclusion. But today I just want to narrow in on this one issue. They didn't expect a miracle. It seems astonishing in this context, where they find themselves in this exact situation again, that they wouldn't expect a miracle. Why wouldn't they be expecting another miracle? Is that on the channel that I'm on, Michael? If it's not, it should be muted, whatever else might be on. All right, well, keep an eye and see if it's on the channel I'm on. If it is, I'll swap to another mic or something. Should they have expected a miracle? Yes, it's clear that they should have expected a miracle. But to be honest, it's not that surprising to me that they didn't expect a miracle. And I'll just tell you from my personal experience, how many of you can look back in your life and think of an event where you believe God intervened in your life? Right? Where there was some sort of a miracle. Now ask yourself, how long did it take me after that miracle for me to return in my head to life as usual? Years? Hallelujah. 5 seconds. The honest truth coming out over here as well. I hope that it lasted in some way, but I would bet that, say, for instance, you prayed when you were about to run out of gas, and you managed to get to the gas station. I bet that you didn't do that the next time. You follow what I'm saying? You put gas in the car at an appropriate time and say, I learned my lesson, I'm not going to push my luck on it. You follow what I'm saying? We generally don't expect miracles to solve our problems from day to day. And so the fact that the disciples just had a miracle that solved this specific problem, it seems, ought to have primed them to be ready to expect a miracle here, and that Jesus thinks they ought to expect a miracle here, but it's not actually that shocking that they don't. Because, well, maybe by this point in their walk with Jesus, 3 some years into his ministry, perhaps, how many meals is that? Maybe they've shared some 3,000 meals with Jesus. How many of them were provided for miraculously? It could very well reflect selfishness. It could reflect just pragmatics, right? How far will this go among all these people? But the implication of selfishness was what Dave said down here, that they've been eating it the last 3 days and weren't concerned about other people. Yeah, that's quite possible. Nevaeh, were you going to jump in with something? Maybe if they had left the food behind, then they wouldn't have been tempted to be selfish for 3 days. That's a little bit parallel to, right? You have the thought in your head and you don't say it. Well, it's probably best that you didn't say it, but it may not change the heart attitude. The response should have been, Lord, we have 7 loaves and a few fish. That should be plenty with God's blessing, right? I wonder if they were anxious that he was going to say to them, all right, well, remember I told you last time, you feed them? So you guys do it this time. Don't kick it back to me. I showed you how it's done. You guys do it. But they weren't ready to take that next step of faith yet, and so they default back to, don't look at us. But they were not expecting a miracle. And out of the 3,000 some meals that they've had with Jesus, there's one that was provided for by a miracle. Maybe 1.5 if you count the wedding at Cana, where the wine was miraculous, right? That was just the wine, not the whole meal. So out of 3,000 some meals, 2 have had a miraculous component. They're good at math, right? They say statistically, the chances that this next meal is going to be provided for by a miracle are fairly low. All I'm saying is, most of our lives are mundane, and the miracles are the exception. And I agree. The disciples were living in an exceptional time and place with an exceptional man, and they should have thought of this as an exception. But yeah. But the reality is, most of us look at those things as exceptions. And most of the time, we're not expecting that to happen. And my question for you today, what I just want to ponder is, when should we expect a miracle? When should we expect a miracle? Well, but why is it then that we don't have more miracles? Anyway, I'm sort of teasing with this, right? Because, I mean, how many of you have prayed for the healing of someone who still died of that illness? And sometimes we seem to hedge our bets with, Lord, if it's your will. And rightly so, in one sense, that we don't want God to do something just because we told him to if it's a bad idea. But sometimes it's because we don't want to look foolish if things don't turn out to be so exciting and miraculous. When should we, can we, pray with confidence, really expecting a miracle? And when should we be content? And I say this in the context of the end of time, when we're told that the people of God will not have miracles, but the enemy will be able to do them. How do we hold on to faith when the people of God don't have the miracles and the enemy of God does? So Sharon, we'll hear from you, and then I have a proposal to make on this topic. Go ahead. Powerful. Yes. Amen. Amen. Powerful. We could just stop right there, because ultimately this is the point that I think we would rightly come to, that if the disciples had been in tune with Jesus and what he was doing, they would have expected a miracle. But because they were disconnected at this point, they couldn't see in the context why it was obvious that Jesus wanted to do a miracle, probably through them even in this setting. And so ultimately that's I think the principle. But I just want to make a suggestion that there are sort of three stages of faith in relation to the miraculous. So God seems to use miracles to affirm people's faith when he is doing something new, when he is entering a new area, and the people there don't know him and don't know his character and don't know about him. God often seems to do miracles to confirm to those people that he really does have their best interest at heart, and that he is the powerful God who, they can abandon their idols and trust in him, and they're not going to be sad that they did it because he's more powerful than what they knew. So we have the examples of the apostles. Paul entering a new place. He shows up after a shipwreck was it the island of Malta? And they are building a fire on the beach, and a snake fastens itself to his hand, and it's a venomous snake, but he shakes it off into the fire, and he's unharmed. And the people go, whoa, has a God come to earth? Is this guy somehow otherworldly, right? It's a miracle. And it so impresses the people that they take Paul more seriously. And then he goes and he prays for the father of the leader of the island, and he's healed. And the people are ready to line up saying, tell us about the God that you serve. So God seems to use the miraculous to enter new territories. But there seems to be a stage in which he holds back the miracles. in order to test the faith of the believers, to make sure that they have faith in him and not just faith in miracles. And so we have stories like Job, where the miracles do not happen for the man who trusts in God. And the question is, does Job trust God, or does he only trust the protection that God might offer him? And we benefit significantly because it turns out Job really trusted God, and not just the power of God on his behalf. But, so then the sort of second generation, if you will, of Christians die of cancer and old age, and there aren't miracles to preserve them and keep them alive. And do we still trust God? Or do we say, no, God, you were a miracle worker then. If you're not a miracle worker now, out with the new. I'm going back to the old gods. But I would suggest that there's a third stage. A stage of mature faith. Mature faith that can both handle not getting a miracle when you want it desperately, a Job-like faith, but that also seems to know when to expect one because it is in tune with the Spirit of God. This is a faith and an expectation of miracles that's built on knowing the character of God, seeing what he's doing in context, understanding both his power and his plans. One of the stories, this is a modern story that sort of illustrates this for me. I was told by a fellow named Herb Larson, and he's a layperson who does a lot of speaking and preaching. And on one of the occasions where he spoke at a college university, a young man came up to him afterward and said, I need to find... Herb Larson's very passionate about his faith, and tells his testimony, his story of how God has made his spiritual life just come alive. When he studies the Bible, he says, it speaks to me. I hear God talking to me. I know that he's real. And so this young man came up to him after hearing that testimony. He said, look, I need to find what you have, or I'm done. And Herb said, am I understanding you correctly that you're thinking of taking your life? And he said, yes. I'm at the point of where I either need to find a reason for living like you have found, or I'm going to commit suicide. And it turns out this young man had a medical condition where polyps would grow in his mucous membranes in his nasal cavity. And he had had surgery after surgery after surgery, and they would always grow back. In fact, they'd gone in and actually stripped the lining, all of the mucous membranes out of his nose entirely, surgically removed it all to try to prevent these polyps from regrowing. And it still had not worked. And his family had moved to Canada, this particular area where the top surgeon in the world who dealt with this kind of thing was there. I mean, they had moved there specifically so that he could get treatment. And they had basically come to the end of the possible treatments, and nothing was working. And so this young man, in theory his whole life before him, could see nothing except more and more pain, surgeries that didn't solve the problem. And he was giving up. I mean, he was ready to give up. And here he is, hearing this talk from this guy who's so excited about being alive and knowing God. And he thought, well, maybe if I could find a connection with God, that would give me some reason to live. But otherwise, I'm done. And so they began to meet. And, Herb shared with him about learning to know God in the Bible. And this young man, he didn't know what he's doing, but he began trying to study the Bible on his own. And some girl came up to him in the cafeteria at his school and said, "What's happened to you, Patrick?" Patrick was his name. And he's like, "Well, I'm getting to know God." she said, something has changed about you, just your attitude, your demeanor, the look on your face. She wanted to know what had happened to him. Well, all he had done was, start trying to pray and read his Bible and have a relationship with God. And so next thing he knows, she's like, well, show me what you're doing. I want what you have. And so he's like trying to lead a Bible study with this girl and other people who, came to him, and he's like, I don't know anything about this. So Herb's kind of coaching him and, teaching him how to share his faith and trying to stay, at least enough of a step ahead to have something to share with the people that were asking him about what's going on. And in the meantime, this problem with the nasal polyps has not gone away, but Patrick has come alive, and he goes in to see his doctor. Well, I'm trying to think now. If I'm remembering right, that the sequence of the story I will mess up a little bit. But in the midst of all of this, Herb found himself praying, God, you've got to heal this kid. Look at the influence that he's having already for your kingdom. Then there's his family that don't believe. Why should his life be, consumed with this medical problem? Please, and he's like found himself going, look, I shouldn't be telling God what to do, right? But I found myself just saying, God, you've got to heal him. Well, Patrick goes to his next doctor appointment, and the doctor's asking him, well, what's going on with you? And Patrick said, well, I've discovered God. And he's telling the doctor all about, the transformation that's happened in his spiritual life. Meanwhile, the doctor's got this scope, jamming it up his nose and looking all around, all the kind of thing that he used to do. And, of course, Patrick's sinuses have all been surgically, tampered with and everything. And when you jam the scope up there, it used to hurt, and he would sneeze. It's different this time. And the doctor pulls the scope out, and he says, Patrick, I don't understand what you're talking about, but whatever happened to you spiritually happened inside your nose as well. It is all new. Everything that we removed surgically is back and healthy and normal. Now, I offer that as just an example of a situation in which the person praying sort of knew that this was the kind of time and place for God to do a miracle. Now, he wasn't holding God hostage, saying, if you don't do a miracle here, I'm going to throw out my faith. And he wasn't demanding it, but he kind of was, right? God, you've got to heal this young man. And I think it's because he was in tune and in harmony with what God was already doing. The evidence that God already showed of what he wanted to do in this young man's life. I have seen Herb Larson from a distance, know who he is. But that's sort of one step removed, right? So that's a story, you're hearing me tell about. But similarly, I have one experience in my life where I was part of a group of people praying, and someone was healed. And it was a young man at Redwood that I knew from Redwood camp meeting who had been dealing with migraine headaches for about 7 years, and the doctors could find no specific cause for it. It had totally derailed his education because the headache was always there, but if he tried to read, it got significantly worse. And so he basically couldn't read anymore. He could listen to sermons, he could listen to audiobooks and that sort of thing, but he couldn't read without serious pain. And I'd known him over 3 or 4 or 5 years. He was part of our young adult group at Redwood camp meeting. But one year we had a special focus on prayer. And the guy who was leading out actually said, well, instead of saying to God, God, if it's your will, please do this, let's ask him specifically to bring healing. And if he doesn't say no, let's keep asking until it's clear that the answer is no. So does anybody here have an ailment that's bothering them? This was an experiment in prayer. And this young man said, well, yeah, I kind of have some, pain in my arm. And we said, well, is that related to the ongoing migraine thing that you've been talking about for years? And he said, yes, the two are related. And so, he was not ready to say, Lord, please heal my headaches. But he was dealing with this issue of the pain radiating down his arm at the time. And so he presented that. And so we got together and started praying. And we said, Lord, please show us if you're willing to answer this prayer by making a difference that he will know, immediately. And we prayed, and it hit me in that prayer as one of the other young people was praying. There were several people praying. It wasn't just me. The guy leading out, some other young people. It hit me, God, this is one of those situations, right? Where a miracle would make so much sense. Here's this man, he's young. There's no obvious cause for what's going on here. So there's no way to treat it. The doctors don't know what to do. His education has been derailed. He has a heart for you and wants to follow you, and he's held back by this ailment. Please, God, this would be one of those situations where it would make so much sense for you to do a miracle. And when we prayed, that we just asked him afterward, is there any difference? And he said, well, yes, actually, the pain in my arm, or numbness, I'm not sure that I remember specifically what it was, but that's better. It's not continuing. And so we said, well, that's encouragement to us to keep praying. And so we kept praying about his headaches and the migraines and the ongoing situation. And when we got done praying, we asked him, so, any change? And he said, yeah, I think so. My head feels better. And I said, well, so you mean like you could read now and it wouldn't cause another headache? And he said, well, let's find out. And he went over and picked up the Bible and began to read. And he was fine. And he's been fine since that day. And has been able to continue his education. He's been involved in a restaurant ministry over in Oakland. Anyway, so I don't take any credit for that, but I'm telling you, I saw this with my own eyes, that God still does miracles. And sometimes I think he speaks to us and lets us know what he wants to do, and that we can and should pray in confidence that he's looking to act in a miraculous way. Now, I love miracles. But the fact is, I only really need 3. I only need 3 miracles, and 2 of them I already have. The first miracle, the first act of divine intervention that I absolutely have to have is the miracle of creation. And when we look around, even inside a building, and imagine the engineering that has gone into the molecules that make up the physical world. When we look around and see the miracle of biology in our bodies and flowers, and we ought to go, wow, this is a miracle. So we already have that first miracle. The fact that we're sitting here discussing this with each other means we have the first miracle that's absolutely essential for faith in God. The second miracle is recreation, conversion. The fact that my desires and my focus changed dramatically from before I was converted to now. The direction that I was going in life changed from what I was going to do to what God has led me into and what I am doing. That is a miracle. It's just as supernatural as the miracle of creation. When somebody's heart is changed and they learn to love God and his kingdom first and foremost over everything else. It is absolutely a miracle. And I've seen that happen in my own life. So I have the first 2 miracles that I need. There is one more miracle that I absolutely have to have for this whole business of faith in God to be worth it. And that is the miracle of the second coming. If Jesus does not return and raise the dead to life, right? If the dead are not raised, we're still in our sins, and all that we have believed in has been in vain. I have to have that, or the whole thing has not been worth it. But I'm confident, because of the first two miracles, that that miracle is coming. So when should we expect a miracle? Well, it begins with appreciating the miracles we already have. Appreciating the miracle of creation, the miracle of conversion. We shouldn't expect miracles if our hearts are not aligned with God and His mission. We shouldn't. But if they are, if we've had the miracle that aligns them, should we expect always to be miraculously healed? Always? Every time I get a cold, should I expect miraculously to be healed? Well, miraculous in the sense of the creation miracle that God has put in my body that allows it to heal itself. I suppose I should always expect that. But some of us will get sick, even at young ages, from communicable diseases, and God will not do a miracle. So, should I always expect one? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. I need to be mature enough to say, God, I trust you that your third and final miracle is going to take care of any sickness or disease or problem that I have in this life. I trust you with that. So I don't have to have you, let me have a charmed life so that if I step out here over the edge, I can't fall down, right? No, I would expect to have my share of trouble and sickness. And if I get cancer and die young, I don't say, why me, God? I say, well, why not me? I know you. I trust you. I have hope for a future. Better me than someone who doesn't. But if we trust and know Jesus' heart, if we're walking with Him day by day, if we're in conversation with Him, I think that He is well able to make plain to us when in our prayers we should expect a miracle, when we should be bold, when we should call on Him publicly in front of other people to do what can't be explained any other way except that He has answered our prayers. I want to walk with Jesus in such a way that I can say, oh, this is just like last time. Yeah, I should expect a miracle. And be in tune with what God is doing. May the Lord bless you as you pursue maturity with Him.